week, you need to watch the video and turn a report in. Morgan already got hers, so she's ahead of the game. Yeah. Just bring me the report. Nope, I don't want you to email it to me. Stuff gets lost in my email. Hand it to my hands and then you'll get credit. You can email it, but then you might not get credit for it. So, yep. So that's how we'll do it. All right.
Can I write it with pen?
You can type it and print it. How's that? How's that? Like you do any report that you miss a class for.
Triple space.
No triple space. Don't listen to anything Cameron says at all. All right. Well, we are week 12, I believe. Is that right? 11. Someone messed up my sheet here when I was on. So, anyway, okay. So week 11. That's right. And we are we're continuing to talk about the transcendental argument. Now, last week, even though you weren't here, we started talking about the idea of the transcendental argument, and we talked about the moral argument. That's an argument that falls in what I would consider the transcendental argument. Transcendental means it's not physical, right? It's not a physical argument. It's not dealing with matter and so forth. It transcends the physical plane. We might say it that way. Okay, so these are arguments that are not science-based in the sense of we could put them under a microscope and study them. These are arguments that are not necessarily philosophy-based, okay, where we started with the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, cause and effect type argument. But these are arguments from the concepts of things that we know exist and yet don't fall within the realm of physical reality in that sense, studyable physical things, such as, i.e., last week, morality. Okay, we know that morality exists, and yet at the same time, there's not a physical explanation for reality, and you can't put it under a microscope and study morality. So it falls outside of that line, which makes it what we would term as transcendental. Okay, now there are other types of transcendental arguments, and so we're going to try and cover conceptually a number of other transcendental arguments that would, in my opinion, fall into this category. Now, you might find that if you were to look these arguments up, some people put them under teleological arguments, fine-tuning arguments. I think that they are completely out of place in that category. We'll cover teleological arguments in the next few classes. But these arguments aren't about fine-tuning. These are about things that we can verify they exist. They're just not tangible, right? They're just not physical. And so, but teleological arguments fall within the scope of science. They're measurable, okay? Whereas these things aren't per se measurable in the same way. So the first tonight we'll talk about is the argument from consciousness. Okay. Now, different from last week. Last week we might term the argument of conscience, moral, right? Your conscience bearing witness. That would be a Bible term. We would say, well, concept of morality there. All right, the moral argument. But this is the idea of just the fact of consciousness. We know consciousness exists. As a matter of fact, to deny the existence of consciousness is self-defeating, because in order to deny consciousness, you must be conscious, right? So you can't even deny that it exists without having it, okay? So therefore, it must exist. It's a necessity to even have the thinking or the rationality going on in that regard. So it really is one of the most mystifying features that we see in our world, because we understand conceptually, I guess, what consciousness is. It is awareness, if you will. It's an awareness of being. It's an awareness of surrounding. It's an awareness of self. We might look at all those different kinds of thoughts, but categorically, we would bring it down to just awareness. Okay, and the fact is that we have an awareness, but why? Why is there any awareness? If, in fact, this is a cosmic accident and everything is just a series of chemical reactions, why would any chemical reaction ever develop awareness? What would be the necessity of such a development, if you will? It's not as though trees have awareness or consciousness, or plants have consciousness. We would say that animals have a consciousness, okay? But even in an animal, is there some necessity that animals exist? No. Plants could be just fine without animals existing, right? Minerals and rocks and so forth. So the point of consciousness is it goes beyond necessity, in the sense of, even if you were to term the idea of an evolutionary development, consciousness itself is not a necessary state. And as we've talked before, a true naturalist, a true materialist, denies the idea of free will, and we'll get to that also here a little bit later. But they deny the idea of free will, and without any free will, consciousness is not even necessary. There's no need to be conscious if there is no ability to determine anything anyway, right? I mean, consciousness is irrelevant if there is no free will besides that. So let's think about just the nature of the mental, I guess you might say, the nature of consciousness, and kind of lay out the argument from consciousness then. So there is a awareness that individuals have. We might call it a mental state, if you will. And that mental state of awareness is a recognition of existence. It's a recognition of space and time and matter and all kinds of things. Emotion, we might even throw in there, and we'll talk about emotion, but there's just a recognition of those things that also exist, okay? But in saying so, that mental awareness, that consciousness of things existing, has a somewhat necessary argument here, that the fact of consciousness implies that there's something beyond the material. Okay? In other words, if we were purely materialistic, naturalistic, as the atheist is, then consciousness bears no necessity in that realm or world. It's more or less, it's a irrelevance, okay? But the fact that we know there is consciousness, and which cannot be denied without acknowledgement of, okay, creates a necessity to consider the fact that consciousness comes from somewhere other than the material, because it cannot be defined by the material. It cannot be defined or studied. It cannot be isolated, where it comes from, how it comes, why it's different from one individual to another. Your consciousness it differs from my consciousness, but yet they have very similar or consistent attributes one of another, right? That while we all are aware of our existence and our surrounding and so forth, we might interpret those things in different ways, okay? And yet we each have consciousness, right? So there's consistency across the spectrum of mankind, but there's also distinction for each individual, and the fact of individuality in that also bears with it a sense that there's something beyond consciousness than just the chemical reaction, because quite frankly, if we all came from the same chemical sources and have basically the same chemical makeup, which is accurate, and we consume basically the same material, intake of chemicals in some sense, right? We're eating a similar diet, right? Then the idea that we wouldn't be having basically all the same, if it was just from a purely materialistic standpoint, we should basically all have the same type of thinking and come to the same conclusion. You understand what I'm saying? We're basically compositionally almost identical one to another, and our consumptions are fairly consistently similar, at least, right? While you might eat something different than I do, the nutrients that we take in and process are virtually the same, okay? And yet we all have different levels of consciousness and awareness and concepts and interaction with ideas, okay? And the idea of ideas goes far beyond the natural realm. Right? Rocks have no ideas. Trees don't get ideas. Why? Because they have no consciousness. And so while there's a uniformity of nature in the physical realm, the mind and consciousness differ in concept, imagination, and idea, all of these type of things, with no apparent connection exclusively to the physical realm, right? Other than that, we possess it. It's in here, but how and why I come up with ideas that you don't come up with, or you come up with ideas that I don't come up with, right? Why we would ever conceive of one idea being superior to another idea. Beyond, by the way, just functional testing, right? Why we would have concepts in consciousness of preference. All of those type of things are beyond the natural realm. And they lend, because they are beyond the natural realm, they lend then to the concept that there exists things beyond the natural realm. Do you understand where I'm going with this now? In other words, is consciousness a direct source from the natural realm? Well, someone might say, I think it is, but show so. Prove it is.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
What would be the difference between intelligence and consciousness?
Well, they would be linked in some ways, but the distinction in intelligence generally would measure the ability to utilize the brain and so forth, the memory and so forth. That would be physical in that sense. Where consciousness doesn't necessarily require functionality. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So someone who's mentally handicapped has the same level of consciousness for the most part that you have, but their access to the physical usages of the brain and so forth might differ dramatically. Okay, so we know that consciousness interacts with the physical, but there's not a single way to verify. Science has never been able to show that consciousness is a result of the physical. And it can't show that. Okay, it can't verify that. Nor is it possible to show that consciousness is necessary in the sense of the physical, right? It's not a necessary development in that regard, okay? And so evolutional explanations are very inadequate. They're committed to the view that, in principle, evolutionary explanations can give a appearance of an organism and their part, and it's not hard to see how it might account for some things in some ways. All right, if you accept the premise that given enough time, whatever, which I don't accept that premise foundationally, but if I did accept that premise, it still doesn't explain consciousness. It doesn't explain that level. Okay, so the idea of consciousness, or that level of awareness, if you will, it supersedes. Okay, I was get back to my thought here. It supersedes the necessity. It supersedes the physical. It supersedes the physical plane. And if something supersedes the physical plane, that means there are things beyond the physical. Consciousness cannot be shown to, proven, or verified to be exclusively the result of the physical plane. It necessarily exists beyond the physical plane. It must exist beyond the physical plane to have awareness of the physical plane. Because nothing known in the physical plane has awareness of itself in the physical plane, right? Rocks, trees, so forth, all of these things. There's no awareness in those things. Therefore, awareness of self and of other things exists beyond that thing. Hold on, let me finish. If, in fact, then, something exists beyond the material, that means that the material is not exclusively able to verify all things that exist. All right, let me say it maybe in a different way. If we acknowledge that consciousness exists beyond the physical realm, that means that the physical realm cannot account for everything that does exist. That makes it supernatural. And once something is supernatural, that opens the realm or the door to other things supernatural. Secondly, if you acknowledge then also that it exists beyond the spiritual plane, it is not of the physical, it's not of the material, then the question is, where did it come from? And if we consider a source of likeness in that, right? In other words, if we consider a source of equal or greater capacity, we'd have to say, well, it comes from another consciousness. Consciousness stems from consciousness. Now that necessarily eliminates pantheism, panentheism, these type of things, right? Because that consciousness would have to be equivalent to or greater than that which we possess ourselves. And so having that level of identification, the theistic God is the only God that would be truly sufficient to that explanation. Okay? All right, now Caleb, go ahead.
So essentially, you say something that exists outside of the physical. So would you, I guess, that's spiritual? Is what you're trying to say?
I didn't use the word spiritual. Okay? Though you might recognize spirituality in a with consciousness. Okay? But you're talking here about, if you were to say, we're talking about apologetic argument. If I said, well, I believe in the spiritual, and someone says, I don't believe in the spiritual, that's just a figment of your imagination. Okay, maybe it's a figment of my imagination. How would I even conceive of an imagination? Well, I'm consciously aware. That's what we're talking about. Because even an atheist, they cannot deny, they might deny spirituality. They can't deny consciousness. To deny consciousness, you must be conscious. So it's just the awareness. Awareness exists and it supersedes self. In other words, my consciousness supersedes my physical presence. Could something be physically present and not conscious? Yes. That pulpit is physically present and not conscious, right? A robot might be physically present, it's not conscious. And by the way, that's what they're trying to do with AI, right? Is create a sentient being or sentient intelligence where it thinks on its own and is conscious of itself, right? That's what eludes them, is what consciousness is. And that's partly why they want to create AI, so that they can say, well, see, we created consciousness, so it can exist from purely mechanical means. However, that would not be an accurate statement, because even if they come to a point where, and I don't believe that they truly will, even if they say they do, if they were to come to a point where they say, we created consciousness, the problem with that is that consciousness would necessarily not have come from the fact of computers existing, but from the minds of those conscious enough to program things into those computers. It would be code, not hardware. This is hardware. Consciousness is code. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was to say it seems to be the same thing as the like endless domino thing that you mentioned for creation, even if they did consciousness.
It's called infinite regress.
Yeah, infinite regress.
So in other words, my consciousness came from another consciousness, but it can't have an infinite regress.
Yeah.
There had to be an uncaused consciousness there somewhere, yes.
So either way, they have to deal with that.
Which would be the cosmological argument.
So this may be dumb, but what about like, so we're aware of our consciousness, so obviously we're aware that there's something else there. But like, what about like people who are in like a coma or something? I don't know if that makes sense, but like,
They're unconscious. We
Right.
even say that.
right, but like, we're like dreaming or something. Does that get into that argument as well, as far as like,
It's irrelevant to the argument,
okay.
because they're unconsciousness. It would more like that it would support the argument more, because to say that a person can come to a place of unconsciousness requires you to acknowledge such a thing as consciousness, and their physical presence is there, but the consciousness not being there verifies that it's not just a physical attribute.
I had a question. I don't know if I'm not understanding or if it goes deeper, but like, what if, they take that part of the brain that has consciousness that,
There is no part of the brain that just has consciousness. Now, you can lose, you can have brain damage, and to the extent that you are no longer conscious, but there is no part of the brain where consciousness this is the consciousness part of the brain. There's no such thing.
but like, if you didn't have your brain, you wouldn't be conscious anymore?
If you didn't have a brain, you wouldn't be alive.
So would they argue that makes it natural, or does it go deeper than that?
Well, that's all of the argumentation I just gave was about the fact that it cannot be exclusively related to just having a brain. Okay. Because consciousness exists beyond just the physical brain. Remember all the stuff I said already about that? All right, go back and watch the tape. All right? But yeah, I discussed that already. Okay? All right, any other questions? All right, so this is we're in this transcendental argument. We've talked about just the moral argument, but here we're talking about the argument from consciousness. Okay. Now then, we might take it into a different realms. We might argue about, or from this, we might argue like the fact of universal sense of meaning, right? That everyone seeks for meaning. What does meaning have to do with a rock, tree, plant, even a dog? Dogs don't look for meaning in life. Okay.
Can I? Okay. I was gonna ask just because I know someone's gonna ask this, but you know, if you're talking to someone, what if someone asks you, how do you know rocks and trees and mushrooms don't have consciousness because they're all connected through the fungus fungal network and all that stuff?
Yeah. There's not a single scientist on the face of the earth that would say rocks, trees, and mushrooms have consciousness. Consciousness requires self-awareness and so forth. I mean, there's no, that would be an argument of ignorance, not an argument that would bear any validity. Your brothers, someone asked you that?
I have been asked that before.
How do you know rocks don't have consciousness? Yeah, right. Because we use the phrase "dumb as a rock." All right, yeah, no, there would be no indication of anything ever to say that there was such a thing. Right. Now, consciousness, we could say a dog has a certain level of consciousness, right? They know when they're hungry, they know when they're thirsty, they're conscious of themselves, okay? And yet, now then we go from consciousness, though, to another level, something that mankind has that other lesser beings don't have, and that would be the issue of meaning, okay? In other words, this is a level of consciousness that is beyond the animalistic consciousness that exists. So, at worst case, if you just said, well, I don't know about rocks and trees, maybe they have some consciousness. If they do, it's beyond themselves. It's about themselves, right? But here's the thing. They don't seek for meaning. And people seek meaning. People seek, what is this about, right? That's what makes life have value in many ways. That what I do has meaning. My life has meaning. My relationships bring meaning. All of these type of things. And so meaning is something that is existential. It's transcendent above physical, right? A person can have everything physical and still lack meaning, in which case they say the physical is not worth having, I'll kill myself, right? Do you know, really, suicide is a horrible thing, and yet suicide itself, in my opinion, is a verification of the fact that you are more than just the material.
There's no animals.
Animals don't commit suicide. Right? This is a uniquely human issue. And yet, what is the point of suicide? The point of suicide is not to eliminate the physical, it's to eliminate consciousness. And so the sense of meaning is that is another existential or transcendental plane that must be explained. It cannot be explained from science. You can't explain science. Science can tell you what, but it cannot tell you why. All right, in the sense of existentially, right? It cannot, it's like someone might say, there's a kettle over here and it's 160 degrees. And if you put a tea bag in that cup and you pour that that hot water on that tea bag, it'll turn a lovely shade of caramel, right? But that's how to make tea, okay? But why do you make tea? Because I've got to chill and I want to warm up, right? The why exists beyond the what or the how, okay? And that meaning, right? We attach meaning to things, but meaning exists beyond things. And so we might have meaning in a cup of tea of the idea of saying, you know what, when I'm a little bit down, I remember when I was a kid, I used to have tea with my mom. And having a cup of hot tea reminds me of my mom, and I just feel better, right? Well, that's not a physical, tea didn't do that. It was the meaning that was attached to it. You look on your paper right there, or the screen in front of you. There's all kinds of symbols and, lines and so forth. We all can see those things, but there are certain meanings that we attach to them that go beyond the things themselves, right? If we just had random, maybe if tonight we had a bunch of Russian on a page, what would it mean to us? Nothing. Why? Because we don't have any meaning attached to those symbols, right? Or their arrangement. But when we put those symbols into order that we have a meaning attached to, where I see that M and I go, that is an M, right? I've attached meaning to that symbol. The symbol itself could mean anything, but I have attached a particular meaning to it. And then when I put it with other symbols, right, and I put an A and a T and an H, now I have math. But not only do I have 4 symbols, I have a word, each symbol uniting together to form a concept. And that concept has meaning, right? And the meaning can be quite broad, even with a short number of symbols, but the symbols themselves really aren't anything. From a physical standpoint, they're very little. It's the meaning that I attach to them that impacts me, right? DEATH. 5 little symbols that cause us to weep, cause our hearts to feel heavy, our minds to be troubled. But the symbols are nothing. Those same 5 symbols are in many other words, and they don't mean that. But when I attach meaning to them, okay, meaning beyond their existence, meaning goes beyond their being on a piece of paper. That word that they form is a meaning that exists outside of the tangible physical. Meaning is existential. It's transcendental. And it goes beyond just having meaning in my life. It goes to the fact that anything can have meaning because of my consciousness. Right? And so now I'm imposing meaning on things, and I see a green light, and immediately I attribute meaning to that green light. And I see a red light, and that red light has meaning beyond the fact that it's just red, because red in other scenarios might be something completely different. Right? If I see a red glow on the stove, I say, hot, don't touch, right? And I see that red light hanging above the intersection, and I think, hurry up, I might still make it. No, wait, stop. That's the process, right? Okay, so meaning transcends the thing itself, because meaning can vary based upon location and circumstance and all of those type of things. So meaning is not inherent in the item or symbol or color or whatever. It's not inherent in it. It's what we've applied to it. Therefore, it exists beyond the realm of the natural. And because that meaning exists, and because I have consciousness to be aware of it, now I have multiple things that exist beyond exclusively the natural. Does that make sense? All right, so we can take all of those letters, 26 different letters, and we can write thousands of words, each word having a meaning that could take up to sentences to describe the meaning of that word. And then we can take those words and compile them together to form additional meanings, right? And 3 words can convey not only a meaning, but they can convey an impactful statement that could change your life, such as I love you. 3 little words, only a few syllables, 8 syllables, eight characters, right? And yet, wow, life-changing. Or we could take those same 26 characters, put them into those words, mix those words up, and have libraries full of books. All of it because we attach meaning to a symbol and meaning to the combination of symbols and the concepts that come from all that, right? So meaning is not purely physical. It goes beyond that. It exceeds the physical. How about purpose? Why do I do what I do? I mentioned the why, talking about the tea kettle. But purpose, purpose can exist beyond the physical. I mean, my purpose might be to chop down a tree, but my purpose could also be just completely random from anything that had to do with the physical. Okay, again, the concept that we even bother to pursue purpose, it exists beyond simply the physical realm. The idea of needing a purpose, needing a goal, a direction, something beyond just my existence. Yes.
Does purpose fall under that category of meaning?
It could, but it could also extend beyond, because like I said, meaning can have to do with the symbol or color or those type of things, but purpose exists in a kind of a next level of that. We might use the word similarly, but it could have a different intention. All right, how about this? How about emotion? Now, we might be able to tie or link, well, this chemical release coincides with this emotional feeling or so forth like that. But there certainly would be a significant question as to whether the chemical causes the emotion or whether the chemical is released because of the emotion. Right? And I would submit that it's more likely the latter. But just the existence of emotion, again, is transcendent to the physical. Okay? Emotional response is is present in a human, and we might even say, well, to a certain extent, it can be evidenced in dogs and other higher form animals, we might say, right? But then there certainly is a point at which emotion is lost in that descent, if you will, through consciousness, right? By the time you get to cat, no emotions, just completely dead inside, right?
Yeah.
Insects and so forth. They're just instinctual, exclusively instinctual. There's not the emotional, response. And so, emotions certainly, and so an atheist looks at that and goes, well, see, emotions evolved, but there's no reason for emotion to exist at all. We can see that in the lower form. If in fact everything is there is no free will, there's no reason for emotion to even exist, because many lesser forms, life forms, exist without emotion, exist without necessary consciousness. Okay, bugs and these type of things, they don't have to have consciousness to exist. They have instinct. They don't have to have emotion to exist. They just do what they do. They hatch, they do their thing, they go through the motions but there's no emotion necessary, there's no meaning necessary, there's no purpose necessary, there's no consciousness necessary for an ant to do what it does. It is motivated purely by instinct. So emotion, the existence of emotion, is itself, in my opinion, a argument here in the transcendental. Do you understanding where I'm going with all this? In other words, morals, there's no necessary reason for morals to exist in the physical, and they can't be explained by the physical adequately. But then you go beyond that: consciousness, intelligence, and comprehension. All those things, meaning and purpose and emotions and so forth. And then you get to this issue of logic. Now, often when you use the term, and if you were to look up the transcendental argument for the existence of God, it would generally be applied almost exclusively to this issue of logic. And I think it's one of the multitude of things, to me, that are existential. They exist beyond the necessity of the material, and they transcend the physical world. They transcend the physical realm. So it's the argument from logic, okay, is, to me, one of the funnest arguments. I just enjoy it. There's a great debate online. I highly recommend that you go and watch it, between Dr. Greg Bahnsen, Bahnsen, and he debated Gordon Stein, and the topic was, does God exist? And it is a fantastic debate. I love that debate. I thought about just having us watch the debate, but I wanted to kind of get into a lot of these other ideas. Yes.
I just missed the spelling.
Man, you guys.
I know.
Greg, that would be G.
I need the last name, please.
Oh, okay. Bahnsen. And he debated Gordon Stein, Stein. Does God exist? That debate, it's just the audio on YouTube. It's fantastic. I really love that debate. I highly recommend you go listen to it. So, the oversimplified argument is basically this, and we'll go through a little more detailed explanation, but logical absolutes are conceptual by nature. They're not dependent on space, time, physical properties, or human nature. They're not the product of the physical universe, space, time, and matter, because if the physical universe were to disappear, logical absolutes would still be true. They're not the product of human minds, because human minds are different and not absolute. I'm waiting. I'm hearing all the typing. All right. I'm going to go through in more detail here in a second, but since logical absolutes are always true everywhere and not dependent upon human minds, it must be an absolute transcendent mind that is authoring them. And that mind is called God. Let's go back to Pascal's wager. There either is God or not God. That's the only options. God is or he is not. And because of that, there's also only two options to account for something. It's either from God or not from God. Right? And one of them is, if one of them is negated, then by default the other is valid or validated. So part of the argument is that the atheist position cannot account for the existence of logical absolutes from its worldview. And since it cannot account for them, they must come from something outside of what an atheist could account for. And the only thing outside of that would be God. Therefore, they must come from God. Therefore, God must exist. Okay? All right, so let's get into some more intricate of the details. So law of absolutes. Logical absolutes, I'm sorry. The law of identity. Here's some logical absolutes. The law of identity. Something is what it is, and it isn't what it isn't. Whatever exists has a specific nature. Right? This is wood. It is not metal. We can identify it for what it is. Cloud is a cloud and not a rock. A fish is not a car. Right? So the law of identification. Second, law of non-contradiction. Something cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same sense. It's illogical. It cannot contradict itself. For example, to say that the cloud is not a cloud would be a contradiction, since it would violate the first law that it is what it is. And a cloud cannot be what it is and what it's not at the same time. So there's a non-contradiction there. We're in there. Then there's a law of the excluded middle. A statement is either true or false without a middle ground. Morgan is pregnant. That's a true or false statement. There is no almost pregnant, kind of pregnant, right? It's pregnant or not pregnant. Jason is alive. He either is or he isn't. You know, we might use phrases like almost dead. But life or no life, that's really, I mean, there's no in between there, okay? So a couple notes about that. Note number one, the statement, this statement is false, is not a valid statement, logically. This statement is false because it's self-refuting. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's dealt with by like the law of non-contradiction. So it doesn't fall under the excluded middle category since it's a self-contradiction, therefore it's eliminated already. Another note here, if we were to ignore that idea of the self-refuting thing, then there would be a possible paradox. The sentence, this statement is false, does not fit in this law, since if it's true, then it's false, and it can't be both. So paradoxes occur only when we have absolutes. Does that make sense? A paradox means there's no governable absolute here. So the law of the excluded middle is valid except for a paradoxical statement such as that, where it's self-defeating and in order to be true has to be false type thing. And then third, if we admit a paradox such as that it's both true and false, in order to admit a paradox, we have to admit absolutes. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a paradox to begin with. Does that make sense? Okay, so next, logical absolutes are truth statements. We might say it like this: that which exists has attributes and nature. A cloud exists. It has the attribute of whiteness, vapor. As the nature, it's made up of water and air. Vapor, right? So that's its attribute, how we might describe it, but it also has natural elements to it, or attributes to it, that that define it in a more specific way. Okay, a rock is hard and heavy, but we might also define it by its natural attribute of granite or marble or shell or sandstone or something like that. So it has describable features, but it also has natural attributes that go to it, right? So logical absolutes are truth statements like this, okay? Something cannot be itself and not itself at the same time. So it can't be true to state that a rock is not a rock. We already kind of covered that concept, but follow along with me here. Something also cannot bring itself into existence. So in order for something to bring itself into existence, it would have to have attributes in order to perform an action. But if it has attributes, then it already exists. Right? And if something doesn't exist, it has no attributes, so it can't perform any actions. Therefore, something can't bring itself into existence. Now, we're talking about logical arguments here. Okay? Truth is not contradictory. Or not self-contradictory, I mean. It could not be true that you're reading this and not reading this at the same time, because that's self-contradictory. it's either true or false that you're reading this, or that I'm reading this, I should say, or that you're hearing this. It's either true that you're hearing it or not true. I couldn't logically say you're not hearing me talk right now, because for you to hear that statement would be self-defeating, right? It would be illogical. You'd say, yes, I am. I'm hearing you talk. Right? No, you're not. Yes, I am. All right. So therefore, logical absolutes are absolutely true, is the whole point here. They're not subjectively true. They're not sometimes true and sometimes false, depending on the preference or the situation. Otherwise, they wouldn't be absolutes. So we're not talking about everything being an absolute, but there certainly are absolutes that must be true in order in comprehension. Okay. And logical absolutes form the basis of all rational discourse. In other words, we can't communicate without them. If the logical absolutes are not absolute, then we couldn't possibly communicate, because we wouldn't be able to know exactly what was being spoken of. If the logical absolutes are not example here. I could say that a square is a circle, violating the law of identity, or that I am and am not alive at the same sense or the same time. That violates the law of non-contradiction. But no one would expect to have a rational conversation who spoke in completely contradictory statements. Therefore, logic itself, we would say that person's illogical. You can't have a conversation with them. Right? They make no sense. Now, if logical absolutes are not always true, then it might be true that something can contradict itself, which would make truth unknowable and rational discourse impossible. Some of you are starting to go like, I'm getting lost here. All right, go listen to the debate. It's really good. So, since we know that there are things that are true, you exist, I'm speaking to you, right? Then we can conclude that logical statements are true. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to rationally discuss anything or have those concepts. So, if they're not, the basis of rational discourse is impossible, and we wouldn't be able to communicate, and we wouldn't be able to know anything or share anything or think anything. Okay. Now, that's foundational. Now then we go to the next step here, okay? The fact that logic has rules and laws that govern it, what we just described, okay? The fact that there are laws that govern this concept means that those logical absolutes are transcendent. They exist beyond the logic itself, even, okay? Or the discussion itself. They facilitate the fact that discussion is able to even happen, but they transcend the discussion itself. They're not dependent on space. They don't stop being true if you take a shuttle to Mars, right? If we traveled 1 million light years away, these would still be true. They're not dependent on time. A logical absolute is true today and will be true 1 billion years from now. They're not dependent on people. They're not a product of human thinking, because everyone's mind is different. What one person considers to be an absolute, what it might not be what another person considers to be an absolute. People often contradict each other. Therefore, logical absolutes can't be the product of a human mind, because human minds are contradictory. So they transcend that. Did you see the news today about, maybe it happened, yeah, it must have happened yesterday during the, a congressperson, I'll just say it that way, I won't name them. A congressperson speaking to a school talked about how the reason how they say it, they said I'm gonna not try and quote him. I'm just gonna say that basically the moon is made up of gases, and those gases get between us and the sun, and the sun's so hot that you could hardly live there. That person's in Congress, okay? And we would hear something like that and go, oh, wow, they don't know anything, right? But why would we think that, might we think, wow, they're ignorant, okay? Because we understand that conceptually there are logical absolutes, and even though someone might come up with an absurd idea like that, which is completely unscientific, we'd go, yeah, can't have a rational discussion with someone that's that absurd, right? Because the laws of logic preclude it. Can't have a rational discussion with someone that just makes stuff up. Doesn't work, right? So, anyway, okay. So, since logical absolutes are then not dependent on time, space, or people, we also know this, they're not dependent on the natural world. Absolutes, logical absolutes, aren't found in atoms, motion, heat, rocks. They can't be photographed, frozen, weighed, measured. Logical absolutes aren't the product of the physical universe, since that would mean they were contingent on something in the physical universe. If nature were dependent on the physical existence, it would cease to exist when the physical universe ceased to exist. If the argument, so in other words, if the world didn't exist, would those logical concepts still be valid? The answer is yes. Okay. And we can take this into another level of concept, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but natural law itself, the concept of natural law exists beyond that which is natural itself, right? In other words, the logic of natural law is what we observe nature to do, but that if we call it a law, we're saying it governs what nature does. Therefore, it exists beyond nature. Okay? Therefore, it transcends that which is natural. But where does natural law come from? Where do laws come from? Laws come from lawgivers. Right? Logic comes from, the laws of logic come from a lawgiver. They come from somewhere beyond this physical natural realm. Okay? It's transcendent. They're conceptual by nature. It's the process of a mind, the framework of a logical thought process. Therefore, it seems proper to say that logical absolutes are conceptual, if you will. If they're conceptual by nature, then they're not dependent on the physical universe for their existence. If they're conceptual by nature, then what is their nature? It can't be defined by anything physical. Can't be defined by space, time, or matter. And if it exists beyond space, time, and matter, that's interesting. Then something exists beyond space, time, and matter? Then everything's not purely materialistic, is it? See how we come back to this? I mean, again and again and again. And again, what I said, I think it was last class. I don't think that we could take just one of these arguments and say, this argument proves God exists. But I think the weight of compiled arguments begins to weigh so heavily on the side that there must be, logic has to come from a logical mind that exists beyond this physical plane. The laws of logic come from a logical lawgiver, right? The laws of, even the laws of science, we discover the laws of science. We don't write them, right? But the law governs what it does. And so precisely too, by the way, like the laws of math. And we'll get into that side of it in the sense of mathematically and scientifically the fine tuning that must take place in order for everything to exist. But the fact that we can even do math, that math exists. We didn't make math up like they do in, modern schools. And made up math doesn't work, right? So we discover the laws. But laws, we know where laws come from. Laws come from lawgivers. So there's something that must exist beyond, if for these laws to exist, whether it's the laws of logic, the laws of math, the laws of science, or so forth, for these laws to exist requires that something exists beyond the physical material, because these things exist beyond the physical material. The law of logic is not incumbent in my flesh any more than the second law of thermodynamics is incumbent in the rock itself. It describes how the rock will respond or react, but it's not incumbent upon a rock, right? Or whatever material. Therefore, it supersedes it. It exists beyond it. And the fact that we can start weighing all of these things together, we can talk about the morality, and we can talk about consciousness, and we can talk about meaning, and we can talk about purpose, and we can talk about emotion, and we can talk about logic, and we can look at each of these things and recognize that they transcend the material. Okay? Now you're talking about a lot of things that transcend material. You're talking about a moral, conscious, meaningful, purposeful, emotional, logical being. Well, you put all those things together and kind of defines personhood, doesn't it? So it's not possible that it's an impersonal force. It must be personal. And all of those things transcend the physical itself. And so this is what I mean when I talk about the transcendental argument. Okay? And again, often you might look it up and you might just find the argument from logic, but I think all of these things go together to really form a cohesive concept of the fact that those things come from somewhere, and if the source of those things, if there is a source of those things would define a being that is God, who is a personal God. Right? So we're starting to pile up a lot of arguments here that can't be ignored, right? The argument of logic, you might dismiss it if you're foolish, right? You might dismiss it, but dismiss consciousness, dismiss morals, dismiss this, and now you're getting to the point where the weight of argumentation begins to take over, whereas it's not necessarily just a argument, it's the weight of argument that begins to pile up. Okay, and we're just getting started, so we've got a lot to go through when we talk now about the teleological argument. This would be the argument from of fine tuning. Okay, meaning, could we exist? Is it possible for this to have just been a cosmic accident? And I will tell you, there was a point at which they came to the idea there were 22 necessary, exactly tuned things. We'll talk about all those, but that number just keeps growing. A number of things that they now know, oh wait, but if this wasn't this way, and this wasn't, and this wasn't, and this wasn't, and that number just keeps growing of all the things that must be the case in order for life to exist at all, right? And so that's what we call the fine-tuning argument, teleological argument. So we'll get into that starting next week, okay? Questions? Everyone mind numbed now? All right. Dismissed.